Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, I am Shafanny Rasya from Sharif Hidayatullah State Islamic University. Today, I would like to review an instruction book that I have read before. The title is Poem Making: Ways to Begin Writing Poetry. It contains 171 pages. It was published in 1991 by Harper. The writer is Myra Livingston. Before we move to the review, I will tell you guys brief information about the writer. So, Myra Livingston was born in Omaha on August 17, 1926. She is a poet, musician, critic, educator, anthologist, and author, and respected the true craft of writing poetry. Her other books are The Way Things Are and Other Poems, There Was a Place and Other Poems, Call Down the Moon, and many others. Now, let's move to the contents of this book. This book contains 7 chapters. The first chapter is an introduction. It contains 2 pages. The second chapter is The Voices of Poetry. It has 3 subchapters and 3 subchapters with 27 pages, starting from page 3 to page 30. The third chapter is Sound and Rhyme. It has 3 subchapters with 21 pages, starting from page 31 to 52. The fourth chapter is Other Elements of Sound. It has 2 subchapters with 18 pages, starting from page 53 to 71. The fifth chapter is Rhythm and Metrics. There is no subchapter in this chapter, and it consists of 7 pages, starting from page 72 to 79. The sixth chapter is Figures of Speech. It has 3 subchapters with 21 pages, starting from page 80 to page 101. The last chapter is Other Forms. It has 5 subchapters with 44 pages, starting from page 102 to 146. Now, let's move to the summary of each chapter. The first chapter is an introduction. This chapter introduces the background situation when someone usually writes a poem, and also contains of the aims of the book. So it said that this book was written to make it easier for us to know about how to begin to understand what goes into a poem and persuade us to experience the joy of making a poem. The second chapter is Voices of Poetry. It discusses different kinds of voices of poetry. It told the definition, how to identify, and the use of lyric voice, narrative voice, and dramatic voice. The writer also gives some examples of popular poetry in each subchapters, so it is easier for us to understand. Some of the poetry that she gave are I Never Saw More by Emily Dickinson, as the example of the use of lyrical voice, The Adventure of Isabel by Ogden Nash as the example of narrative voice, Gawain by Lillian Moore as the example of dramatic voice. The third chapter is Sound and Rhyme. This chapter discusses the definition, the use, the importance of sound and rhyme, and this chapter also discusses definition, variation, and characteristic of stanza and ballad. The writer also identifies the rhyming form that is the most widely used and the form that is more difficult. The writer also gives some examples of the poem related to the discussion. Some of the poems that she quotes as examples are The Mirror by William J. Smith as the example of a couplet stanzas, Father and I in the Woods by David McCord as the example of tercets, The Kraken by Lord Tennyson as an example of quatrain, Cocoon by David McCord as an example of quintet, The Ceiling by Theodore Rothte as the example of setsets, and The Fox by Anonymous as an example of an American ballad. She also wrote about her experience when pouring her poem into the lines or patterns in this chapter. The fourth chapter is Other Elements of Sound. This chapter explains the definition and the use of repetition, alliteration, and onomatopoeia. She also said that we have to be careful when choosing a word for repetition. And as usual, the writer provides many examples in each subchapters. She quotes some poems as examples. There are The Song in My Head by Felice Holman as an example of repetition, The Lord is on the Loose by Jake Prilatsky as an example of alliteration, and she quotes a poem by Walter de la Mare. The title is The Bee Song as an example of onomatopoeia. And the writer also wrote the definition of rhyme, consonants, and assonance. In this chapter, the writer also suggests us to practice using some element sounds, try writing poems using rhyme, and experiments with consonants and assonance. The fifth chapter is Rhythm and Metrics. This chapter discusses the definition, the importance, the use, and some examples of rhythm and metrics. The writer also explains about common feats of metrics, which contains the iamb, the trochee, the anapest, and the dactyl. The writer also provides some examples from the poem by Alan Fishers. The title is My Cat and I, which is contains two iamb in a line. The Man in the Iron Pale Mask by Shel Silverstein, which used three anapest. Meredith's Party by David McCord, which used two trochees in a line. From a Railway Carriage by Stevenson, which used both trochee and dactyl to create a feeling of urgency and speed. The sixth chapter is Figure of Speech. This chapter discusses the types of figure of speech. There are simile, metaphor, and personification. It also includes the definition, the use, characteristic, the comparison, and the example in each type. The writer quotes a poem by Valerie Ward. The title is Frog, which contains three similes. She also provides a poem by Langston Hughes. The title is Dreams, that using metaphor. She provides a poem by Lillian Moore. The title is Foghorns, which use personification. And in this chapter, she also wrote about her experience when she taught her students about figure of speech, and also told us how to use figure of speech by observing some object around us, such as clouds, trees, sun, stars, moon, etc. And she also introduced some words that are usually used to create each figure of speech. The last chapter is Other Forms. This chapter discusses some other forms of making poems. The writer explained about haiku, the cinquain, the limerick, free verse and open forms, concrete, shape, and also pattern poetry. She discussed the brief history, the definition, characteristic, the use, and how to create each forms. She also stated that writing haiku is not easy. And as usual, the writer also provides some examples, such as a haiku by Bezos, Kezue Mizumura, Joso, and Isa as an example of haiku, The Warning by Adelaide Crepsey as an example of cinquain, Pigorix by Arnold Lovell as an example of limerick, Telling Time by Lillian Moore as an example of free verse, and she also provides some pictures that show the example of the form of concrete poetry, pattern poetry, and shape poetry. What I like the most from this book is that the writer explained each chapter very clearly, and she used understandable vocabulary and quoted many poetry as example in each chapter. She also briefly wrote about her experience when she taught her student about making poems. So that makes this book more interesting. And what I like the least from this book is the layout and fonts of this book that makes me a little bit uncomfortable when reading it. And also the cover of this book that I think is less interesting. After reading this book, I get a lot of insight about poetry, its elements, and how to make it. It also influenced me to start writing poetry, and I just finished my short poem last week. And about this book, I think it will be nice if the writer also wrote some struggle that is usually faced by the beginner who starts making poetry. And it would be interesting if she added some tips for us to keep consistent in practice because, yes, sometimes it is hard for some people to keep their consistency in learning and practicing something. But overall, this book is really good. I recommend this book for you guys, especially for young people or people who want to start making poetry, because this book is so insightful. The explanation is so clear and understandable with a lot of examples. So it will not be hard for you, especially for the beginners like me, to understand the book. Okay, I think that's all from me. Thank you very much for watching my video. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.